let's take a quick look at a Section 504 planning form and some of the elements of the law that play out in developing a form that we're got to use to make accommodations and modifications for a student who qualifies for Section 504. First, there's obviously the basic demographic information, the student, the school, the grade, the date when it was implemented, the date when it was terminated. This allows you to keep this form on hand as a record of when services were ended. I would suggest you probably also send a prior written notice to parents, and that's something we'll learn about more in detail. But a prior written notice is a document you need to send to parents anytime you make a change in their child's educational plan, and it was developed to be used for students receiving special education services, but regulations for Section 504 suggest that you might be in a good place if you use a lot of the process you've developed to deal with IDEA and students receiving special education services to deal with students receiving services through Section 504. There's also a spot here for you to note when you should review this plan. 504s have to be reviewed at least once a year, just like an IEP. And then I should say I had printed out this form and I had it sitting around home the other day, and my wife saw it, and she is a special ed director for a charter school and does a lot of 504 plans, and she said it looked pretty good, except that in the version that I had originally printed, this area was a lot smaller for accommodations and modifications. She suggested that I widen it, so that's what I've done. We should be able to list the area of difficulty, the accommodation or modification that we're applying, the person who's responsible, so that we keep track of this, and any additional comments we need to make. Remember, this is all individualized. So let's consider James. James, the person in our scenario, is having trouble getting from class to class. And it may be that his school team says, you know, he's been tardy a lot. School regulations say you get kicked out of school. If you're tardy 3 days in a row, you get kicked out for a day. And that's going to have to happen to him unless we change the rules. So in that case, you might have an accommodation or modification of the school guidelines in terms of being late to class. Or maybe the accommodation or modification is that he gets to leave his previous class early. Or maybe he's in a school building that really doesn't cause him to be late. That's why this is all individualized. You don't just have an accommodation or modification that fits for every child who uses a wheelchair for mobility. We've got to consider where the child is. We've got to consider what the task is that we want them to get done. And then we can consider the accommodation or modification. So we've looked at a scenario, we've looked at an eligibility form, and we've looked at this sample Section 504 planning form. And I think you can see that they all incorporate elements of the law.